So let's talk about first about our example here, zealots, right? Okay. So with this attitude, like you said, zealots in the Roman Empire in the time of Jesus were Jewish people, the sect of Jewish people who wanted to militarily, right, by force, overthrow the empire to return God's kingdom.
Yep.
Okay. So what I draw from that, some equivalence would be a Christian posture that not only views American history in a very optimistic light with reference to its Christian foundation,
Sure.
but views Christianity then as the optimal point for society and for American politic and political discourse to return to.
Yeah.
In other words, I would sum this as Christians who want to make America Christian again.
Sure.
So let's talk about a little bit of the benefits. What are some of the pre-understandings? What are some of the assumptions? And what are some of the limitations of that?
Yeah, I think, a couple of the ideas that we see from this is, maybe there's an idea to talk about this in a way as we see what it would look like to be positive about kind of the returning to an assumed understanding of like Judeo-Christian roots for where it stands as for us as a nation. It would be very easy to go back to this kind of way of thinking because it's what we dealt in at least in terms of our rhetoric, for quite a long time, right? And it would be a discussion that would serve the current majority population in the country, right, where it is overwhelmingly white, like 60+% of the population of the country still being like that. So it would be something that would make the majority population comfortable for the short term, right? It would be something that would tamper down some of the charged rhetoric in the current moment, not where we're going right, in the next 10 or 15, 20 years in terms of population dynamic shift. There, but for the immediate stuff, it would quell. It could potentially quell some of the discourse.
So you see not only a kind of religious value correlation, but you also see like a demographic correlation relationship there. So tell me a little bit more about that.
So I don't know how long this would last, and I don't know how well this would solve the problems deeper beneath the surface, right? That you and I would probably agree both exist in our country as a whole, right?
Yeah.
But insofar as putting a nice sheen on things or like a patina of sorts, right? The idea of being able to speak with a similar language out of some assumed correlations of Judeo-Christian values would give the overwhelming majority of people the same starting point from which to do their dialoguing. And when you both agree on some foundational understanding, it's easier to kind of move and navigate back and forth. And because there's some common ground, it's a little bit easier to potentially give and take at times.
Gotcha. So what are some things that come to your mind if I use this phrase, this slogan here, right? Like, make America Christian again. What does that mean? As far as you understand?
God back in schools.
Okay. So like prayer?
Pledge of allegiance before every type of thing. Flags in churches again. God bless America. In churches, like the song being sung on like national veteran holidays, right? So
Memorial Day.
Yeah, those kinds of things. The idea of kind of more traditional or stricter Christian values in the way that we view things like marriage, right? So one man, one woman.
That's probably
only,
a big one.
Right?
Abortion's probably a big one.
Abortion's huge. Probably Second Amendment kind of conversations and things around there. And probably like very defined gender roles, right? Like more specifically, kind of moving like men do X, women do Y, and understanding those things and adhering to them in a little bit more of a stringent fashion.
Okay. So you have kind of a colliding of sorts of religious values, demographic values, and then kind of like cultural values.
Yeah,
so that's fascinating.
In a very simplified way, like a Leave It to Beaver kind of old show from like the 1950s, where it's like mom is in the home and cooks all day while wearing pearls, and then dad comes home from work or whatever, and mom gives him like a pipe and slippers and dinner's ready. Like that kind of idea where it's like very simplistic in the way that it displays life for people.
Interesting. So I could see where you're coming from on that. I'm not sure if that's entirely fair. Right.
It's a little caricature. Yeah. I freely admit that, for sure.
To the perspective, because and we've talked a lot about this. A lot of the circles that I'm in, both with my church and a lot of the people that I hang out with, are going to be a lot more conservative.
Sure.
So some of the things I'm hearing from them, I think comes out of, one, I think there's a level of honesty that's there in terms of an anxiety and a fear.
Sure.
About what is it going to look like to be in a country that is maybe not even mostly influenced by Christianity, but when it becomes opposed to it.
Sure.
What is that going to look like?
Yeah.
And so a little later on, we're gonna talk about some of those specific examples.
Yeah.
So what I want to do is be as charitable as possible in saying that I think the people who would adhere to this attitude of wanting to say, hey, like, no, we should be involved in gaining influence, whether it's in media, whether it's in politics, certainly in a presidential election, right? The desire to be involved to gain influence at first hand, I want to say that I understand the honesty and the genuineness of people who want to say, like, no, I want people to benefit from this. If America is more Christian, more people are going to benefit from this.
Well, sure, and you have, you have history to point to in some sense, right? And the idea of the prosperity of America as a whole coming out of particularly the last 100 years, right, with the world wars, kind of decimating the rest of the world and kind of leaving an open room for the economy to grow here. Like the idea of saying, a lot of those undergirding principles were found on like the idea that your word was bonds, you followed through with your actions, right? Like you didn't lie to people. Yeah, all of those things were
standing up for the underdog.
Yeah, those things were very pertinent to the idea of making our country what it was in some ways.
So having said that, what are some of the limitations that you see?
Yeah, I think probably one of the biggest ones I see is it tends to ignore what I consider a large reality and swath in American history.
Okay, so what do you mean by that?
I mean, America has struggled, I'll say, with profound racism throughout the totality of its history, not just, the conversation of slavery, but you look at the way that a lot of white groups came over and how they were treated in terms of, Ben Franklin was pretty anti-German, anti-Italian.
Right. I was going to say, like,
and so there was massive
original Italian migration.
Yeah. And so I say that to say, not to compare white and black kind of disenfranchisement at all, but more so to the conversation that America
hasn't always been easy.
Well, America's always been afraid of change. Yeah. And America has always chastised change in its rhetoric because that's what human beings do. Yeah. Humans don't like change, or disruption is probably a better way to say it. And so to simply kind of paint with the brush of saying like Christian values kind of undergirded things and stuff was a lot better, it makes me feel like there's a bit of a reminiscing for a time period that never really existed.
Interesting.
Because it seems to ignore, not intentionally, right? Like I don't think it's a bad faith thing for the most part.
Yeah.
But I think it has a propensity to ignore what the reality of history
and some of the
like.
Undercurrents that were there all along.
Oh, I mean, just not even undercurrents, just things that were out in the open.
Yeah.
Right. And so it seems a little bit disingenuous of history itself to me.
I see what you're saying. So it sounds like what you're saying is an attitude of engaging with the current climate that says, hey, if we could just enforce, or I don't know if that's a fair word.
Get back to.
If we could somehow begin to support or get back to traditional Christian values, then that would solve some of these issues.
Yeah.
It seems like a simplistic solution.
Yeah, I mean, it just seems one that's not rooted in anything reality-based to me, right? So it's like we should always be pushing people to not lie. We should always be pushing for things that make it, so abortion never even needs to happen, right? Like better economic conditions, better health conditions, all of those things are great.
Yeah.
But I don't know how trying to go like to traditional Christian values is going to only be the best way to solve those things, because a lot of the times those things weren't really playing out in the historical format that people are kind of saying, or to the level of which people seem to be assuming, right? So I always want America to be more Christian, right? Because I think Jesus led by examples of love, inclusion, kindness. Servant leadership, all those things.
Those are all
for
great
sure.
things.
Amazing.
You're not saying they're bad.
No, not even remotely, right? Like if America was a Christian nation in the way that I define a Christian nation, right? Which is, of course, like, it's my opinion, so of course I want that there, which may not be the best opinion, by the way. But I just don't always know where the person who's having this conversation is. It's kind of a nebulous definition that can
really
shift a lot.
No, I think that's a really good point, because what kind of Christianity? Make America more Christian. Well, but what kind?
Yeah. We've got over 3,000 different denominations that have sharp divisions over sanctity of life, or sharp divisions over how we should treat the wife or the husband in the home, like sharp division over how gender roles ought to be assumed or divided, whether gays can be married or not, or whatever, right? And so it's like whose community, which interpretation are we talking about?
That's fair. Yeah, that's really fair. So it's just my observation that the people that I hear mostly saying, let's make America Christian again, are the people who have the most to lose in terms of social influence.
Yeah, probably.
So as a Hispanic of, first generation of immigrant parents in a majority immigrant church, right? We don't have skin in the game in that sense.
Yeah,
right?
for sure.
So
sure.
like we never had political influence, so we don't have anything to lose. So it's really interesting how that perspective would be different with people who look like me than perhaps
people who look like me. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
So that's interesting. And I know that correlation is not always causation, right? I'm just saying that's interesting how those two factors collide, because making America Christian again has very real consequences for political benefits and influence and power that don't benefit everybody.
Yeah.
So maybe those are some of the limitations.
Or benefit people disproportionately. There, right?
Yeah.
And so, I mean, and it's a big deal, right? Because now, especially in this recent election, the Hispanic vote was one of the most important votes to try and win. Like both Donald Trump and Joe Biden campaigned really heavily in Hispanic areas. And so as the dynamics are shifting away from kind of ensconced white power thresholds, right? And I don't say that negatively or as a slam against white people. It's like there's some natural clamor that's going to inevitably arise out of that. And some people will do it from a place of like genuine concern. And some people will just be less disingenuous, more disingenuous about how they approach it.
Yeah. The last thing I want to say on this is the level of winsome or efficiency that enforcing principles has, right? So you can think about when you were a teenager, or maybe a lot of our viewers can relate when they were teenagers. There's this natural tendency to not want to do what you're told to do.
Always.
Right? And so I wonder about the ministerial or efficiency of, hey, if we just put prayer back in schools, and if we just started saying Merry Christmas to everybody and refusing to say Happy Holidays, or like whatever the case may be, right? If we just made this back to the cultural norm, like would that even work?
I mean, it doesn't work with most young Christians I know,
right?
And so, and that's not a slam,
or
to be intentional, but there genuinely seems to be what it's felt like a generational divide here in a lot of these conversations.
Correct. And so I wonder, what's the theological cost?
Yeah.
That's what I'm asking of that attitude. And how much do you lose if you want to gain that?
Yeah, I mean, you got to pick and choose your battles.
Correct.
Right? And it seems like this position has a potential pitfall to make many things a battle that don't necessarily need to be.
Yeah.
Right? And that can be a difficult position to find yourself on the wrong side of. Because you can accidentally alienate people.
Yeah, I think that's fair. And I want to reiterate that our intention is always to be as charitable and to view people who hold this position as honest.
Yeah, of course.
As honest as we can.
Yeah.
For sure. So this would be our analogy of the zealot, right? Somebody who is overtly and intentionally saying we need to gain influence so that we can confront this shifting culture with that influence to regain it.
And one more positive thing to say about it, right, is like this makes sense from a very logical-minded position,
from
right?
It's a pragmatic position.
Well, I mean, government's just the most big tool in our tool belt.
Correct.
There. So, of course, you want to wield some type of what you perceive to be as positive influence over it because you genuinely think it's going to help the most people there. And so people who hold and maintain this position aren't coming at it from like a manipulative power grab kind of way. It's in a real interest of the other that they're trying to serve. So when Jesus says, love your neighbor as yourself, they themselves identify this way, and so they think that this is the best way to love their neighbor. So don't hear, it's not like a mad set of critiques just coming out of the gate at it. Like, these are just different things that you could potentially fall into.
Correct. Good.